WBUR Podcasts, Boston.
I'm Darrell C. Murphy, and you're listening to The Common. The school year got off to a rough start for some districts in the region. There have been issues with school buses, teacher strikes, and in Boston, a near takeover of the district. Since we're approaching the halfway mark for the school year, we checked in with Suevon Lee. She's the editor for WBUR's education team, which makes her the perfect person to school us on how things are going for districts in the region. Suevon, thank you so much for coming by.
Hey, Darrell. Thanks so much for having me on.
Absolutely, had to do it. Especially now, because we're thinking back on 2022, and it seems like there was a lot going on in public schools this year. How would you briefly summarize the school year so far?
Disjointed?
Okay.
It really depends where you're going to school. Of course, if you're a student in Malden or Haverhill, you had teacher strikes to contend with. If you were a student in Boston, you might not be getting to school on time because of your late bus. So it depends on where you're a student. But as you alluded to in the intro, there were a slew of challenges already awaiting kids when they started this school year.
Right. And let's not forget, kids are still rebounding from, the 2 years of disruptions and remote learning due to the pandemic, right?
That's absolutely right. To that point, this school year was actually one of the first years since the pandemic where students felt like it was perhaps a little bit more normal due to the lack of face mask restrictions and other types of protocols that were in place during the pandemic. And so as Carrie Young, for instance, reported from a Brockton middle school attending their first day of school where the mood was light and it was open and enthusiastic. So we did have that going for us in the beginning of this school year as far as it returning to look a little bit more like normal.
Okay, that's a good thing. We'll hold on to that. I want to kind of get into the school bus crisis that we saw at the beginning of the year. Can you tell me what happened there?
Sure. I mean, the beginning of the school year coincided with the shutdown of the Orange Line. So what Boston Public Schools had to do was sort of supplement the traditional fleet of buses with shuttle vans and really sort of be creative as far as getting kids to school. I mean, that was about a 2-week disruption. So that on top of regular school bus delays, which has been an ongoing thing for many years, sort of exacerbated the challenge for parents and students. What we saw was that there is still inconsistent transportation for students, and so they're not getting to school on time, or the bus might take forever to come pick them up, or they may be not picking them up on time when it comes to returning to their homes. And so that is why this would be kind of a big challenge and, as you mentioned, crisis.
Got it. And I mean, what does that look like for parents? What are they having to deal with because of this?
As the education reporters fanned out in the first day of the school year, some of these parents just sounded really resigned to the fact that they could be waiting at a bus stop. Some of them had to shift gears and take their kids to school and drive them there themselves. And I think it's just also the lack of communication by school officials about where the bus is. That was also very frustrating for them. So I think it's just sort of this piled on issue.
So how are things looking now?
Well, not too much better. The Boston Public Schools are still only at an 89% on-time arrival rate as far as November goes. So they still have a ways to go. I mean, just as recently as last month, the Boston School Committee members were discussing the transportation issue and even throwing ideas out, for instance, using Lyft, like the rideshare app, to take some of these kids to school. That's how bad it was.
Yeah, and I understand that state education officials have began investigating whether the unreliable bus service for students with certain disabilities, I understand they're looking into whether that's violating their federal rights.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up. There have been sort of student advocate groups who've raised their concerns and have alleged that this is federal discrimination for certainly students with disabilities who also very acutely rely on these buses to get them to school. And so that remains ongoing.
Okay, moving on. We also saw teacher strikes in 2 Boston area school districts. Can you tell me about that?
Sure. These were not super long strikes. I believe one was a few days, one was about 4 days. And so we're not talking about weeks-long strikes. But more importantly, I think what these teacher union strikes signal to us is that just bubbling discontent among the teacher ranks regarding pay, regarding classroom supports, regarding classroom sizes. And more importantly, the teacher strikes in Malden and Haverhill earlier this year sort of signal what may be to come. The solidarity among teacher unions across Massachusetts school districts is quite high. And as Max Larkin reported earlier in the fall, this sort of movement of teachers kind of coalescing to protest working conditions or to advocate for better conditions in the classroom and in the schools is a trend that we may continue to see heading into next year.
Okay, bet. Now, another big story of the year was this 11th hour push to avoid a state takeover of Boston public schools. What steps has the district taken to put itself in a better standing with the state?
The systemic improvement plan struck between BPS and the state was sometime in the late summer, so, right before the beginning of the school year. Now, the agreement really sort of came up with these different buckets of areas in which BPS has to improve upon over the next 3 years. But keep in mind, there are certain benchmarks they still have to hit between now and then. Mm-hmm. So for instance, school bus arrival times, it's got to be 95% this year. Well, we're not seeing that, so they're not hitting that benchmark. Mm-hmm. We're talking about coming up with a better plan for special education students. A few weeks ago, an outside consultancy came out with this review, which sort of flagged some of these issues going on with the classification of students with disabilities. In Boston, there's a much higher rate of identification. It's 22% of kids in BPS are classified as special ed, compared with 14% nationally and 19% in Massachusetts, and a disproportionate share of kids identified with disabilities are Black and Latino boys and also English language learners. So what this review really revealed is, Boston needs to do a better job of identifying who really needs to have additional supports. So that was definitely an issue that is also part of the systemic improvement plan. Facilities is another big bucket. Boston has to make some repairs to kind of decrepit buildings and spaces. So that's another part of the systemic improvement plan, and just better data collection. So these are all sort of areas in which we'll be watching as far as what kind of reports come out and what their plan is to improve infrastructure.
Okay, got it. So, I guess there's still a lot of work to be done, which makes sense, right? Because they just pulled themselves from the brink, so to speak, right?
That's right. Yeah, there is a lot of work to be done. And the title of this plan has a sort of weighty meaning like a systemic improvement plan, but these are systemic issues that they need to address. And so it remains to be seen, especially with a new superintendent at the helm, Mary Skipper, who just officially started her role in September, how her leadership will help shape some of these plans moving forward or strategies as far as trying to hit the benchmarks that were outlined in the plan.
Right. Yeah, and you bring up the new school superintendent, Mary Skipper. Any sort of evaluation you can give for her first few months?
So she's only been in the role for several months, and in the superintendent sort of longevity range, you might say that's actually not that long of a time. But she's a veteran Boston school administrator, former principal, so she knows the system very well. So in conversations that we on the education team have had with education folks, they're very optimistic about what her leadership will bring. She knows the system, essentially.
We're going to take a break, but we'll be right back with more from Suevon.
Did you kill Marlene Johnson?
I think you're one of the first people to have actually asked.
From WBUR and ZSP Media, this is Beyond All Repair, a new podcast about an unsolved murder that will leave you questioning everything.
Somebody should be in jail for murdering my sister.
A woman who's never been believed.
As long as they think I have done this, then they're not looking for who actually did this.
And that's what makes it a cold case.
No, it's a botched case.
And a search for the truth, once and for all.
Wow, it just gets more interesting.
Beyond All Repair. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
Be careful. You're digging in a place that's been very peaceful for a while.
Do it anyway. Dig.
And we're back. Earlier, you mentioned that this is the first year where things are getting back to normal for students and that there's an overall positive vibe. But I'm curious to know about the mental health support in schools. Are students getting what they need to make that transition back into a normal-looking school year?
Yeah, that's interesting you bring that up because counselors are in very short supply. And we know that that sort of social and emotional support is what many kids need right now.
Right.
They need the trusting adult to speak to at school. And so there is a lack of school counselors, but I did want to note that this whole priority is kind of being re-strategized, especially in some of our charter schools. So Max Larkin did a story about the diminishing college-going rate among Boston's charter schools, which historically, many of them were founded with this mission to encourage their graduates to attend higher ed, and not just any higher ed, but a 4-year institution. But between 2020 and 2022, we saw the college-going enrollment rate drop. At one East Boston charter high school, for instance, it was something like 86% of students were enrolled in college as of 2020. As of 2022, that percentage dropped to 63%.
Wow.
So one of his stories earlier this fall sort of examined what's going on there and how are these schools sort of shifting their focus. And what he found was that school leaders are really concentrated on students' well-being to bring it back to students' mental health, right? So they're putting more stock in offering kind of on-the-ground support. One charter school called Codman Academy just made its Dean of Alumni a full-time position. So what she does is she checks in with students once they graduate. So that sort of investment in just checking in and being a support individual, an adult for kids, I think is what we're seeing at least in the charter schools, as Max reported. Okay,
so Suevon, we just discussed some pretty important topics. What will you and your team be looking out for as we head into 2023?
One issue we're going to be looking at is this biannual literacy screening requirement that the State Education Board just passed in the fall, which takes effect in July. So Vanessa Ochovilio is going to examine one school district who's already ahead of the game and how they're trying to, screen their youngsters for their reading skills early on to provide small group instruction. Carrie Young will be looking sort of at how certain schools are becoming more support centers. I keep saying support, I know, but this is kind of a big theme, I think, for this year. And how are these schools providing some of that assistance? We'll continue. We mentioned the Boston Public School Systemic Improvement Plan. We'll be continuing to look at whether those buckets, whether they're addressing those adequately or not. So those are just some of the things we'll be looking into.
Got it. Some pretty big stories, pretty big topics. So yeah, I'm excited now to see what y'all got coming. Suevon, thanks so much. It's always a pleasure to talk. So I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Daryl.
That's WBUR Education Editor Suevon Lee. And that's all for today. Make sure to hit us up on Twitter at WBUR The Common or shoot us an email at thecommon@wbur.org. We would absolutely love to hear from you. In the meantime, I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.